A common view held by many non-CHamoru's and even CHamoru's themselves regarding the CHamoru language is that fino CHamoru is a mixed form of the Spanish language or a Spanish-based creole. Therefore, modern fino CHamoru is inauthentic, impure, or a fake language because supposedly the original pure CHamoru language died, and what remains is just an amalgamation of Spanish, Filipino, English, Japanese, etc. The problem with this type of logic is that it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what languages are and therefore creates a misconception on how to view fino CHamoru. The modern CHamoru language is a legitimate language like any other, and it deserves respect as such. Guahu si Pulan, and in this video, I will break down this common argument to demonstrate why the CHamoru language is its own language and not a mixed form of Spanish or a Spanish-based creole. This idea that CHamoru is not a legitimate language due to having Spanish or foreign elements is rooted in an essentialist or purist framework, which asserts that in order to be considered a real language, fino CHamoru must be pure and must maintain a rigid indigenous lexicon and syntactic structure free from outside influence. This type of thinking about language is wrong, yet all too frequently held by CHamoru's and non-CHamoru's. No serious modern linguist or social scientist holds this purist view of language because it does not align with the complex social reality of language. While it's tempting to think of languages as distinct, unchanging, pure entities, it is imperative to understand that languages are not so objects-like. Languages are fluid, constantly in contact with other languages and language varieties, and always changing. Let's take modern English, for example. English today sounds vastly different than it did 1,000 years ago. Here's how English sounded like in the 10th century, known as Old English.
Fadaruda thude erton helvonum, si din namaje halgod, tobe kume vin riche.
It sounds like a completely different language. Here is the same meaning said in 15th century Middle English.
Ure Vader, dat art in hevenis, hallowed by the name, the kingdom come to.
You were most likely able to identify that it was the Lord's Prayer. While still sounding different from modern English, you were probably able to understand most of what was being said. Finally, here's the Lord's Prayer in modern English.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come.
All three audio recordings were of the English language. The changes in pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and syntax reflects the socio-cultural and political changes that were occurring throughout the history of the English language. Here are some notable events that influenced English, beginning with the introduction of Old English to Great Britain by the Anglo-Saxon cultural group in the 5th century. English was then influenced by Old Norse in the 9th to 10th century due to Scandinavian invaders and settlers. In the 11th century, the Normans invaded, a cultural group from France, introducing many French words into English. Many Latin words were coined and began entering English during the Renaissance period and the Scientific Revolution. Why is all this important? As linguist Sarah Thomason stated, language contact is everywhere. There is no evidence that any languages have developed in total isolation from other languages. This example of the evolution of the English language shows that languages do not exist in a social historical vacuum, meaning languages are not isolated static entities that are trapped in one particular time period or one particular region. Otherwise, we wouldn't consider modern English as an authentic English language because it doesn't sound like English from the 10th century. So this idea of a pure language that does not change because it is free from outside influences does not reflect reality, as there is no such thing as a pure language. Every single language changes over time, and every single language especially incorporates loanwords from other languages. Which leads to my next point, that just because CHamoru contains Spanish loanwords does not mean that fino CHamoru is an inauthentic language or a mixed form of Spanish. When languages begin to add loanwords to their lexicon, the recipient language do not usually use the loanwords the same way that the donor language does. As linguist Martin Hasselmatt explained in a 2009 article, the source words of loanwords often have phonological, orthographic, morphological, and syntactic properties in the donor language that do not fit into the system of the recipient language. In such situations of lack of fit, which are the rule rather than the exception, loanwords often undergo changes to make them fit better into the recipient language. For example, the pronunciation of Spanish loanwords is adapted to fit with the phonology of the CHamoru language. Here are some examples. Good afternoon in Spanish is buenas tardes. Good afternoon in CHamoru is buenas tardes. God in CHamoru is Zeus, which comes from Dios in Spanish. Not only did the vowels change, but there is a stop between the two vowels as represented by the glotta. The Spanish word for table is mesa. In CHamoru, it's la masa. In addition to the vowel change, the definite Spanish article la is fossilized in the CHamoru word for table. If we were to add the article la to the Spanish word mesa, we would get la mesa, the table. However, in CHamoru, you cannot remove la from la masa, as it is now part of the word. In addition, the loanwords become a part of the speaker's lexicon as any other native word, and the speakers treat it as such. Speakers don't think to themselves, I better not use this word of foreign origin, otherwise I will be inauthentic or speaking another language. No, they use borrowed words like any other words. Here's one way to think about it. You or other native English speakers use the words alcohol, tsunami, and umbrella all the time, and you don't think to yourself that, geez, alcohol is derived from the Arabic word alcohol. Therefore, I better not use it. Same with the word tsunami, which comes from tsunami in Japanese, and umbrella, derived from the Italian word ombrello. You don't do that because you consider these words as part of the English language. Notice also how the pronunciation of these loanwords changes to fit with the English pronunciation. And these are just a few examples of how languages incorporate loanwords as part of their lexicon. And when used in normal speaking situations, there is no inner debate as to what words are authentic or inauthentic. Yet for some reason, this principle only applies to CHamorus when they use loanwords in fino CHamoru, even though every other single language does this. Take the CHamoru words hasta, taza, alhajas, azúcar, and café. While all these CHamoru words are derived from Spanish origin, if you were to ask many CHamorus, especially older CHamorus, if these are CHamoru words, they will tell you that yes, these words are CHamoru. It's not until someone comes along and starts declaring that these words are not real CHamoru, and then uses this to delegitimize fino CHamoru, where then CHamorus start questioning the value and legitimacy of their own language. It's one thing to acknowledge the etymological roots of words and another to place a language's value and authenticity based on etymology. However, this purist argument against the legitimacy of fino CHamoru actually contradicts itself. The notion that CHamoru is inauthentic due to the borrowing of Spanish words cannot necessarily be applied because many words in the Spanish language are borrowed words themselves. Let me provide some examples. Hasta, from Spanish, hasta, from Arabic, hatta. Taza, meaning cup, from the Spanish word taza, from the Arabic word taza. Alhajas, meaning jewelry, from the Spanish word alhaja. The Spanish word came from the Arabic word alhaja, meaning necessary thing, valuable thing. Azucat, meaning sugar, from the Spanish word azúcar. The Spanish word came from the Arabic word azúcar. Café, from Spanish café, from Arabic kahwa. In other words, these CHamoru words that CHamoru's borrowed from Spanish, the Spanish borrowed these words from Arabic either directly or indirectly. Yet, no one questions the authenticity of Spanish because it has loanwords derived from Arabic. The average native Spanish speaker isn't thinking to themselves, I'm using this Spanish word derived from an Arabic word, therefore my language is a mixed form of Arabic. Furthermore, the same people who argue that CHamoru is somehow illegitimate because it has borrowed words don't argue that Spanish is an illegitimate language because it borrows from Arabic. Around 4,000 Spanish words are of Arabic origin. If we're going to apply the notion that fino CHamoru is just watered down Spanish, let's be consistent and say that Spanish is really just watered down Arabic. And if you want to be especially ridiculous, you could start examining the words that CHamoru borrowed from Spanish that were borrowed from Arabic that were then borrowed from other languages. Let's look at examples. Taza, meaning cup, from the Spanish word taza, from the Arabic word taza. Ultimately from Persian, tas. Azucat, meaning sugar, from the Spanish word azúcar. The Spanish word came from the Arabic word azúcar, which came from the Persian word shakar, and the Persian word came from the Sanskrit word shakara. This shows you that the whole idea that borrowed words makes a language inauthentic or a mixed form of that language is ridiculous. Yet for some strange reason, this notion is really only applied when people are trying to delegitimize fino CHamoru. Claiming that CHamoru is inauthentic or a mixed language due to the presence of Spanish loanwords or words of other origins is an inconsistent application of linguistic principles and logic. As Thomason pointed out, when languages beat and influence each other, the most common specific type of influence is the borrowing of words. So you cannot assert that CHamoru borrows words and not apply this same line of thinking to other languages. It does not make sense. Then perhaps it's the amount of loanwords that should determine a language's legitimacy. People who make this argument believe that since the CHamoru language has so many borrowed words, that it cannot possibly be a distinct language. After all, the CHamoru language experienced a massive instance of borrowing during the Spanish colonial period. So how many words does fino CHamoru actually incorporate from Spanish? An examination of the CHamoru dictionary reveals that fino CHamoru has many words that are derived from Spanish. According to a 2003 article authored by linguist Tomas Stoltz, linguist Rodriguez Ponga performed a word count using the 1975 CHamoru English Dictionary. He compared the Austronesian components found in fino CHamoru against Spanish and found that the Austronesian component makes up for 42.5% of the lexicon, whereas up to 5,300 words of Spanish origin cover 54.9%, with the remaining negligible amounts comprising words of English and Japanese origin. At first glance, this percentage may seem high. What's important to consider is that this estimation of Spanish-derived words includes all the words in the 1975 CHamoru English Dictionary. This means that even archaic words that are no longer used in everyday speech are included in the percentage total. Moreover, the percentage of borrowed words in the CHamoru language is not atypical of other languages using the same methodology. For example, English has around 75% of its vocabulary borrowed from multiple languages. Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese have around 60% of their vocabulary borrowed from Chinese. Persian has 40% of its vocabulary borrowed from Arabic. The list goes on. The actual spoken speech of all these languages, including CHamoru, uses significantly less borrowed words from these dictionary-derived percentages. Furthermore, different comparison methods demonstrate that the ratio for borrowed words yields an even lower amount for CHamoru. In the same 2003 article comparing the core vocabulary between CHamoru and Spanish, using both a slightly extended 200-word list with synonyms and a 100-word list with no synonyms, finds that 39% of the 200 CHamoru core words and 20% of the 100 core words are of Spanish origin. Using a criteria for determining classifications of mixed languages from a 1994 study authored by Bakker and Mu, where the cutoff point for the lexicon is above 90%, none of these methods determining the ratio of foreign words in CHamoru comes even close to the 90% mark. This indicates that not only does CHamoru borrow significantly less relative to languages like English, but that CHamoru is not a mixed language by the very criteria determining mixed languages, and that CHamoru contains much less borrowing than what's commonly believed. In linguistics, languages are classified on the basis of their genetic relationships, their origin from a common ancestral language. Therefore, they have common features that distinguishes them from other groups of languages. This type of genetic relationship between languages can commonly be seen in the grammar and syntax. This is also why the current vocabulary of a language is not really taken into account in determining the language categorization. Even if a language has a large number of loanwords and its vocabulary changes a lot, that does not change the categorization of the language. In regards to fino CHamoru, linguists have already determined that CHamoru and Spanish are completely different languages. CHamoru and Spanish are genetically unrelated, and they trace their ancestral heritage through completely different language groups. CHamoru developed from Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, which is a subgroup of the Austronesian family tree. Depending upon the literature, CHamoru is either in the Western Malayo-Polynesian branch or CHamoru is in its own independent branch in the Malayo-Polynesian subgroup. Therefore, the inclusion of Spanish loanwords in no way affects how CHamoru is classified due to it being a part of the Malayo-Polynesian family group. Separate from Spanish. Conversely, Spanish is a member of the Ibero-Romance branch of the Romance languages. If you want to trace the Spanish linguistic heritage further, you would find that the common ancestor of the Romance languages is Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin comes from the Italic languages, which is a subgroup of the Indo-European language family. Therefore, there is no merit to the argument that CHamoru and Spanish are the same language or even related at all, because CHamoru is part of the Austronesian family group, while Spanish is part of the Indo-European family group. Others have brought the classification of CHamoru as Malayo-Polynesian or an Austronesian language into question by arguing that CHamoru is really a creole. A creole is a new language that arises when communities of people who share no common language come in close contact with each other. Usually, creoles begins as a pidgin, which is a dramatically simplified form of communication between two groups of different language communities. When this pidgin language is passed on and becomes the native language of the next generation, it then becomes a creole language. Features of creole is that the vocabulary is mostly derived from the higher prestige language, and that there is a simplification and reduction of grammar between the two contact languages. If modern fino CHamoru is a creole, then it can no longer be classified as Malayo-Polynesian, as the origins of CHamoru would be from both CHamoru and Spanish. However, this is not the case. Fino CHamoru is not a creole for three main reasons. First, there is no evidence that there was a pidgin stage, which is typically a prerequisite for creoles. Second, as already mentioned, the majority of the core vocabulary of CHamoru is native. And third, most crucial of all, there is a lack of simplification and reduction of grammar, which are found in creoles. In conclusion, CHamoru is not a mixed form of Spanish or a creole, and the inclusion of Spanish loanwords or elements does not affect the linguistic classification of fino CHamoru as an Austronesian language. If we were to determine the legitimacy and authenticity of a language based upon this idea of so-called purity, then no language could be considered legitimate. The idea that the modern CHamoru language is inauthentic or a fake language because the language is not the same as it was before the Spanish influence is the incorrect view to have. The CHamoru language was already changing long before the Spanish set foot in the Marianas. The CHamoru language in the 15th century was definitely not the same as CHamoru in the 10th century, and 10th century CHamoru was definitely not the same from CHamoru in the 5th century, and so on. The changes to the language due to the Spanish reflects one of the many instances of change that has occurred throughout the history of fino CHamoru. Every language has a unique history, and the changes in the language reflects that history. By ignoring the holistic view of fino CHamoru's history and reducing it to the Spanish colonial period is not only problematic but harmful to the continuity of CHamoru. As eloquently stated by linguist Steve Pago in a 2018 publication, there is even less evidence suggesting that CHamoru has bred a new language or mixed with Spanish to form a new language. Modern CHamoru displays a considerable density of copies from Spanish and should therefore be considered as a high copy language/code. But both from the genetic and the typological perspective, CHamoru remains a Malayo-Polynesian language, lacking the core characteristics of the Romance, Pidgin, Creole, and mixed/intertwined languages. In the next video, I will further demonstrate that CHamoru is not a mixed form of Spanish, a Spanish dialect, a Creole, semi-Creole, etc., through a grammatical comparison of CHamoru and Spanish to show the differences and similarities between the two languages. Sedus Masi for watching. This is PulanSpeaks. See you in the next video.